Warren, thanks so much for being on the program today. Read your report, your recent report, with great interest. But for those who haven't read the report, what's the one headline that you want people to understand? I mean, the report is called Megachurch Resurgence. What exactly is resurging?
That's a great question. And Warren, it's great to join you. And there are, for those who want the short version, there are 35 different graphics, each with a different headline. So in essence, he's asking me to pick what's my favorite or what's the resurgence. So you can do a quick read or you can sit down in the chair and have a long, detailed read. The resurgence piece is far more than coming back after the pandemic. The first, all churches, all sizes, had a major reshuffling during the pandemic, both a reshuffling of the saints and, in a lot of ways, how they do ministry. And and the churches that are growing again, disproportionately large churches in this study, are doing things a little bit different. So it's not just going back to where they were and then continuing on, but it's new surges of, and then we highlight different very specific things, whether it's community outreach, finances, young adult ministry, small groups, and we can go through different details. But we tried. It's far more than just attendance numbers. So we tried to say what's a word that can summarize the more than a comeback, and resurgence was the word.
Yeah, you used resurgence. You explained why. You careful. I'm assuming you at least considered the word revival and chose perhaps not to use that word. Um, there are people who are saying we're in a revival in this country. I'll be candid with you and say I don't see it in the numbers. I don't see it. Ryan Burge doesn't see it. Gallup doesn't see it. Barna doesn't see it. So my question is, how can you be sure that this resurgence is not just a redistribution of membership from medium and smaller churches to larger churches?
A great question. Let's go back to revival. We'd all love to see that happen.
Amen.
Revival starts with hearts that are being changed, and then the outworking is measurable things like attendance or prayer or engagement or inviting friends and the like. So we're able to measure specific indicators, but we can't measure what's going on inside. Um, and now bring me back more to your question.
Well, if it's not a revival, we don't, or at least we can't say for sure that it's a revival. And this resurgence is really about megachurches, about larger churches. How do we know that this is not just a redistribution? I hate to use a negative word, but some people would call it sheep stealing.
Yeah, or in one academic article I read, the reshuffling of the saints.
Yep.
And and that's a hard thing to say in part because if you listen to the major pundits who say, well, the state of the church overall is going downhill as measured by membership is down overall, and people prior saying my relationship with God is very important to me, that's down, and attendance is down, and any number of measures are going down overall. And here's a group that's unique, almost uniquely, but distinctly going against those trends and drawing numbers. And it's easy to say, okay, is that just coming from other sized churches? And to a degree, yes, but to a degree, no, in the sense that a distinctive characteristic of larger churches is trying to reach people who are not connected with any faith group, who don't have a prior uh, engagement with other Christians or with God in a church setting. So the intention, the focus, the things we ask about are we're trying to reach the harvest field out there. If others come along for the ride, that can't be helped in some ways.
Right, right. Well, let me ask you a little. I mean, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, Warren, because there's just so much to cover here. But I am curious. I've been reading about megachurches and church growth for, probably 40 years off and on. Going back to some of the Elmer Towns stuff back in the 70s.
Albert
And
Towns is one of my heroes, and he and I wrote two books together.
yeah, exactly right. I I'm curious about definitions. You guys focused on churches that had I think an average attendance of 900 or
Well,
so.
we go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the kind of the standard megachurch definition is 2,000 and
Yeah.
above, and then there's a lot of talk now about maybe we should also have a mega or a super mega church category because we've got a lot. We now have a growing number of churches above 10,000, and
About 100 such churches claim more than 10,000 in person on a weekend. Yes.
which is historically unprecedented. I mean, we've never seen that in American church history. Maybe in ancient church history, but I don't know. But anyway, to stay on point here, is there a question in our future? The answer is yes. There is a question here, and that is, how did y'all come up with these definitions?
Yeah, real good. Okay. So classically, historically, and this was framed by and popularized by the co-author of the report, Scott Thumma of the Hartford Institute for Religion Research, that megachurch is in person, 2,000 or higher adults and children on a typical weekend. Now, this report that people can download for free, 35 graphics, lots of commentary to go with it. This report is actually part of a series that was started in the year 2000. So it was 2000, 05, 2010, 2015, 2020, and now 2025. And way back when, in the year 2000, in order to have enough responses for statistical significance, the cutoff that had been named as megachurch didn't have quite enough. So they said, well, let's take 1,800 and up because, a large church may fluctuate up and down by that much. And the characteristics are generally the same. So let's go 1,800 and higher. And because of that, every subsequent study, we called it megachurch, which is 2,000 and higher, but we actually were a little squishy in pulling the 1,800 to the 1999 attendance into it.
Yeah.
Then, to make things more complicated, we thought, okay, but what about those in the 1,000 range? Shouldn't they be at least a comparison group? And then we thought, well, if we're cutting off at 1,800, maybe we should dip down just a little bit below that. So we did 900 up to 1,799, and then 1,800 up technically, but in our survey banners and all, we called it 2,000 and higher or the 1,000 group, and we put a little footnote to explain.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fair enough on that. But I guess what the real spirit of that question, Warren, is that a group of churches that have 1,000 in, let's just pick, because there's actually a fair number of those kinds of churches,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
There are
just
for listeners, there are 1,800, 1,900 churches that are 2,000 and attendance and up, and I have a list of them. So, I can name them. In the 1,000 to 1,999 range, I don't think anybody has a list, but I've got several thousand, and our best estimate is there may be 6,000 or so in that 1,000 range.
Yeah, so a big number, and you can just from a statistician's point of view, you could actually probably come up with some statistical norms with a data set that large. You could come up with mediums and that sort of thing. But in the megachurch category, it could be really different. I mean, a church with 2,500 is going to be really different in lots of categories from a church with 25,000.
Correct.
And I guess what I'm wondering is, were you able to see in the data? It says megachurch resurgence and that churches are thriving. Is one subset thriving more than the others? Is the 1,000 to 1,500 membership church doing really, really well, and the 25,000 and above just kind of doing okay, or vice versa?
The technical word is stratify. We stratified the data on a whole bunch of questions. So what does this look like for the 1,000 in 1999, 2,000 and 2,999, 3,000 and 3,999, and on up. And by the time we got bigger, it was like 5,000 to 9,000 and 10,000 and upward. And where the difference was statistically significant, we pointed that out in the commentary, or if it was dramatically so, we made a graph that showed, like, for example, when we talked about internships, residencies, ministry training program, you can predict that the larger the church, the more residents per year they're able to process. And that was so clear cut that we made a separate graphic out of it. But to your
Right.
specifically to your question of is the comeback happening at the higher levels? Um, yes and no. As a gross generalization, yes, the biggest churches are growing the fastest, but there are an awful lot of churches that last year were 1,000 and this year maybe or next year approaching 2,000 and 3 years from now maybe approaching 4,000. And so there's a lot of transition within the numbers.
Warren, help. I mean, and I'll just confess to you that I'm kind of a small is beautiful kind of guy. But part of the reason, I mean, I've got all kinds of reasons for that, and I'm not going to process or litigate with you right now. But th- but I do have my reasons. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
And so, kind of make a case for this for a megachurch resurgence being a good thing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
rather than a bad thing. In other words, when I look at the culture and I see, increased secularization, I see increased polarization, I see a diminished confidence in the church by the population as a whole, and I see over that same 40 or 50-year period the rise of the megachurch and the decline of the smaller church. I'm not. I understand that correlation is not causation, but if you don't at least ask that question, I think you're kind of an idiot.
I think it's a really good question. First, the name megachurch is pejorative in today's popular view. If you Google it for newspaper, print, magazine, and the like articles, there are far more negative terms, most of which are inaccurate. But those rich megachurches, those blank megachurches,
Right.
uh, which says there's a stereotype out there, which I hope this report bust a lot of those stereotypes. And just one aside, uh, one of the stereotypes is, oh, it's a baby boomer phenomenon. Actually, no, there are now more millennial and Gen X megachurch pastors than there are together, than there are baby boomer pastors. So that's one myth debunked. But a lot of pejorative views of large churches and inherent suspicion, which is why to your earlier question of, well, is there a new term for, the churches that are like 10,000 or higher or 20,000 or higher? Um, if there is, it will be a scholarly or specialized one because large church pastors don't like megachurch in general to begin with, and they're
Right.
certainly not going to like some specialty term. And in fact, like Life Church, which is today the largest attendance
Yeah.
church in the United States with 40 some odd campuses,
Yeah.
has a
Craig
has
Groeschel, Oklahoma. Yeah. Yeah.
yes, has a sign in most of its campuses. We are not a megachurch. We are, a city focused, local community focused, because they perceive that the stereotypes of the word megachurch are not what they want to identify with. So
Yeah.
now
Yeah. That's
that's the words. You asked me to, whatever you call it, can we make a case for large churches? And other studies have shown, have compared church sizes and have found that Bible literacy among regular attenders is now, I'm going to say all the strengths of the megachurches. We could do the same thing with many strengths that smaller churches have that big churches do not. But I'm going to rattle off that engagement levels, Bible knowledge levels, invitation levels in terms of people willing to invite, or not willing, but who are actually inviting their friends to church or church activities. Those are all um, strong in the large church community and often stronger than in other church sizes.
Warren, it's easier. I mean, I know this is a daunting task for even to measure attendance. So I commend you and Scott and others that are in this world of statistical analysis and sort of looking at the metrics and the analytics of churches. So I'm not trying to diminish that exercise at all, because I think it's important, and you guys do a great job with it. That said, it is easier to do that than to measure spiritual maturity. The fruit of the spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, long suffering, etc. Forgive my language, but butts and bucks, right? People,
Well, the three B's, butts, bucks, and buildings, or
in
the
buildings.
ABCs, attendance, buildings, and cash,
Yeah.
are
Those
the
are easy. Those are easier to measure
easiest
than,
metrics to measure.
yeah.
And
So,
and they are part of an output that shows something, often something good is happening,
mhm.
but it doesn't measure certain things that we wish social scientists knew how to measure, such as how effective are we in making disciples of Jesus Christ? How effective are we in helping people love God more with all their hearts, mind, soul, and strength, love their neighbors more as themselves this year than last year? Um, that is hard. The best we can do is work with outcomes of when those heart transformations are happening, what fruit does it show?
Right, right. Well, let's talk about that for a little bit, because given that is the goal, the ultimate goal, and that these things that we can measure, that you are measuring, are indicators, process indicators, and not ultimate outcomes. How would you recommend that a church leader or a ministry leader, or for that matter, just a lay person, someone who is, concerned for the vitality of their own church, how should they use this information? How should they use this report and these data?
That's a really good question. And I hope they'll come and see it first to bring hope, to say, okay, this looks like evidences of God is at work, and would that he would do likewise in my community. But even more so, to look at ideas. For example, we ask in two of the graphics, are you using your facilities to serve the community? If so, what are ways you're doing it? Now, maybe a large church can do 5 or 6 different things. We can have support groups here. We can let the community use our ball fields or basketball area. We can, do after school tutoring. We can blah, blah, blah. That's great. Maybe scaling down to different sizes of churches. Maybe they can only do 3 or 2. But here are ideas for you. Here are examples for you. And I think that in itself could provoke a discussion that says, all right, look, in this church, people are inviting their friends more. What is it about our church that could give our people an excuse to invite their friends? And how
Mm-hmm.
can we support that? Large churches are doing leadership development in significant ways. Okay, scale to us. How can we be doing leadership development in a way that develops future leaders and ultimately as future ministers as well?
Yeah. Warren, a few minutes ago, you mentioned that this study is just the latest chapter in a study that's been going back a couple of decades, and so the numbers for 2025, possibly, and this is what I wanted to get you to respond to, reflect a bit of a post COVID bounce.
Mhm.
So first of all, is that so? Do these numbers reflect a post COVID bounce? And two parts. The second part of the question is, 5 years from now, when you do this study again, what are you going to be looking for as evidence that this is not just sort of a blip in the radar screen, a post-COVID bounce, but that this was the beginning of a real and lasting trend in American religious culture?
Your second question is easiest. You make sure to ask the same questions and get a use your weighting, WEIGHTING, to make sure you have a representative audience that matches each of the survey periods. The harder question is, what does this trend mean? And the survey, as I mentioned, started in the year 2000, and it actually wasn't just megachurches, it was all size churches. There are certain core questions, attendance being one of them, that's asked about all size churches. So the average congregation in America, median number, in the year 2000 was 160 people in attendance. That went down every single 5 years till the year 2020, when it was either 60 or 65. Now, that in itself is a sea change, because what you could do with 130 people in terms, or 160 people, or 200 people even, in terms of supporting a minister full-time and supporting a facility and all, you can't do as viably at 60 people. You need to start talking about bivocational or sharing facilities, or generating separate income and all. Now, the upturn for 2025 is 65, which is the movement in the right direction. But against the long term, it's still only beginning. And however, that 65 plus something that's happened since the pandemic, an online audience. Now, online attenders, from separate research, we know that's often a door that leads to in person. Uh, of those who watch online, it's usually not the same commitment level, engagement level, involvement level, but it's way better than nothing, and especially if it's a start. So you have 65 today plus online presence in some way, and that's movement in the right direction. And God willing, in the year 2030, that number will be documented as going higher. In fact, the survey research team was so excited, and frankly, the Lilly Grant people have done so well with their drugs and all. And then the Lilly Endowment is the world's largest funder of religious research.
Yeah.
Have talked about, well, maybe in 2028 we could do kind of a partial to see how we're doing, and not have to wait till 2030.
Yeah, that would be, of course, I'm a data geek, so any additional data would be interesting to me. Um, Warren, we can't drill into you mentioned the number of charts that you had and so on and so forth. So let's just stipulate for the record, we can't do it all here in the short conversation, but we hope for our listeners it'll be a bit of a teaser, and
Yes.
we'll have a link to the full report in the show notes for today's program for you listeners that want to really dive into the numbers. But there is one area that I did want you to speak to just a little bit, because here at Ministry Watch, our mission is to serve Christian donors. We want to give donors the information that they need to be more faithful stewards of the resources God has entrusted to them. And you do have some some information about money in this study. One notes that that there is more giving in these churches as well. And I guess my question is, can you kind of tell us a little bit about that? And is it a function of, people being more generous, or megachurches tending to serve more affluent suburban communities, or both?
Okay,
Or
great question. So we can go a lot of directions, and there are several graphics. First, the giving, even when adjusted for inflation, has grown from the last survey, 2020, pre-pandemic, to now, and it's grown even, well, it's not only outpaced inflation, but it's outpaced the rate of people growth, which in part is explained by recurring giving online. And that large churches kind of pioneered that, and the vast majority were doing it well before the pandemic, but they
Right.
didn't have such high percentages of their people participating. And then when the pandemic kicked in,
Yeah,
so
let me
many,
pause you there, Warren, because I think this is a really important point. And
yeah.
how do you know that? Because I can tell you that my wife and I are that way. You know, we would put a check in the offering plate every week, and then we'd get to the end of the year, you know, and we would say, oh, you know what? We only made, we didn't make 52 contributions. We made 35 or 40 contributions. And when we went to online giving, it was every week, every week. And so I know in my own experience that online giving has made us more regular and more consistent in our giving.
And there was a specific study done about 8 years ago, it was before the pandemic,
Yeah.
that checked that and found that like 300 some odd dollars per year per household more when you do recurring giving.
Okay. Well,
And
anyway, so I apologize for going on that rabbit hole, but I think that is an important point that churches need to pay attention to, and that also probably individual donors. If you're not doing online giving, you're probably not giving what you think you are. And so anyway, I'm sorry, Warren.
no, no,
Take it
no.
away.
That's very important. And may I editorialize? I'm part of a church plant right now, and I'm not on staff. I'm a volunteer, so I get to be a counter among other hats. In a church plant, you wear lots of hats. I'm a
Yep,
greeter. I'm on the prayer
I've
team. I'm
played
on.
that. I've
Okay,
worn that hat.
but I'm a counter, and not only does money come in, but it's a lot of people's way of starting. I'll give this way, and then as I grow spiritually in my commitment to God and my commitment to this church, then maybe I'll do the online and recur. And I think
Yep.
that anecdotal story is representative. But so the first point in all of this is uh, giving has gone up, and it's been helped in part by um, on online giving, but it's also been helped by frequency. Now, like I'm personally in church every week, but not at my church. This weekend, for example, I will likely be with my wife at our kids' church. So, but my tithe is back at the church plant we're part of. So,
Right.
so the frequency of attendance has gone down by churches of all sizes, and yet for at least some, the consistency of giving, whether they're there or not, has climbed. So that's one factor on the giving. Then you alluded to the charts about kind of the accountability and transparency and all. And we did ask questions about that because that's a suspicion and concern. And first off, the majority of megachurches have an independent board structure, meaning the majority are not family members, paid staff, or others who would be beholden to say, "Oh yes, let's vote the senior pastor a raise, my dad," or all. So the independent board a board, having an independent board at that is a very positive thing.
When you say
Then,
majority, how, is it like a large majority?
and well, it's 82%, and if you exclude the don't know section, which looking at the graphic, I should have,
Yeah.
it would be somewhere around 84, 85%.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is good. I mean, the fact that 100%, it's not 100% is a little bit discouraging to me, but that's a conversation for another day. So keep going, Warren. I'm sorry.
That is, and all of you listening who might be part of that, whatever, 15% or so, that you don't have that independent board factor, that makes a difference. And there are wonderful groups that out there that can help coach you on how to set up
Yeah.
the independent board. But now another question we ask is, are your church's financial statements prepared each year by an independent CPA, and that could be either a compilation, a review, or an audit? And 82% said yes, every year. And an additional 8% said, which brings us up to 90%, said yes, just not every single year. So only 10% said no. At this scale and size, we don't have a audit. And then the next question we ask is, does your church make its CPA prepared financial statements available to those requesting them? And again, the vast majority said
Yeah, well, that's great and interesting and very valuable information, Warren. For those listening, I will just editorialize a moment and say that I think all three of those numbers should be 100%. And if your church is not in that 85 or 86% category, I just want to say this plainly: your church is an outlier. You should be asking serious questions of your leadership if you are in that 10, 15, 18% category. So I think that's one of the real values of your data, Warren, is that it allows me to see, is my church adhering to best practices, or is my church an outlier? So I think that is one of the real values of this kind of data.
Well,
Warren, we
let me give you one more correlation because this will
absolutely,
affect your world. If you do those statements and if you make them publicly available, that does show an increase in per capita giving. My interpretation, because greater trust is there.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's great. Of course, we don't give to get. We give out of obedience and out of joy and generosity. But that's good to know. And for church leaders, I hope that they take what you just said to heart. Warren, we've got to land this airplane. Just, I often ask, my guests, especially one that's a whole lot smarter than me, as you are, is there anything that I'm just not smart enough to ask about this data, or in the midst of all of this data that we've talked about, there's one idea that you want to make sure doesn't get lost?
First, you are an excellent interviewer. I have enjoyed listening to your podcast over the years, and you prepare well as you did today, and you ask great questions. So I do not accept your smarter hat. But I do know the data a little bit better. And
Absolutely.
let me say two things that were particularly encouraging to me. One is the role of ministry residents or equivalent, which I alluded to earlier, in terms of training future leaders. This intentional leadership development is there, and it's there. The larger the church, the more likely to do it on scale, which is no surprise, and that bodes really well. The other is we ask a new question that had never been asked on the survey before. What has changed since the pandemic? And I
Mm,
went around to about a whole bunch of friends and ministers and all. I said, what do you think we should throw in there to test? And we gave 15 different things like, are you doing Holy Communion more often now? And it's simply more, the same, or less since the pandemic, which doesn't mean you aren't doing it before the pandemic. It's just, have you increased even more? And the top one was the spiritual interest of young adults that our community, our church is serving. Wow. The second one is our engagement in our local community around that. Wow. And the third and the fourth had to do with going deeper in discipleship, in training people to be disciple makers. And it's like, wow. Now, if that's true, that's a very encouraging uh, direction and indicator about churches going forward, and
right.
fills me with hope.
Yeah. Well, and me too. May it be so. But we'll check back in 2028 or 2030 or whatever it might be, and see if this has come to pass. The fascinating data, valuable data, important work. Thank you, Warren, for being on the program today to share it.
A joy to be with you.